Okay, shall we get started? My voice is a little better today. Not great. Hopefully you can hear me. First of all, any questions on the rest of the course, on the homework, the midterm that's going to be happening from now on until we're done? That's a good sign. That people know what they're doing. It's a bad sign if you don't care, I suppose. I can't tell the difference. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to sort of talk about some of the economic reasons of why we have security problems. That there are certainly technical reasons, but in general, for almost every problem we've talked about a technical solution. And so sort of lack of technical solutions is not really why we have security problems. A lot of it comes down to why people don't want to pay for it. Yes?
Can you put on the slide that asks for the password? Like this slide, put on it.
On the course web?
Yeah.
That is interesting. Oh, I think I know what happened. And there's a question mark next to it, perhaps?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, try reloading again. Try better.
Yeah.
The link was broken, and the wiki software, if the link is broken, will sort of assume you want to create a new page or you need a password. I will tell you the password is not very secure, though. So it is really to make it difficult, not to make it impossible, because it seems kind of a low-risk operation. The first thing I want to do is there's a beautiful new bug that came out announced today that is very pertinent to what we were talking about, so I thought I'd bring it up. I was just reading about this on the way over and add this slide. So last week we talked about SGX. And SGX was this model where there was an execution environment where you can run code, where you can run things that you can verify what code is running, and you can all the data that is accessible inside that execution environment, called an SGX enclave, is not accessible to the operating system. So it turns out that ARM processors, which are used in every cell phone today, has something similar. They call it a trusted execution environment. Qualcomm has their own called QSEE, and it has similar capabilities about being able to store secret keys there so they can't get out. So a security researcher said, yeah, there's probably a problem here. And so he spent a lot of time sort of looking at when you encrypt things with your secret key inside your enclave, what happens? And he found, using a tool that would sort of measure cache timings, that there were some very subtle timing differences in the cache that were measurable. And what's interesting is that Qualcomm knew this was a potential problem and tried to build countermeasures into the chip to prevent this exact leakage from happening, but he was able to bypass those countermeasures. And so on a Nexus 5X phone, he was able, through about 14 hours of measurements, to recover the secret key that is used for sort of secure information inside of Android, inside of Qualcomm, inside this secure execution environment. Which is bad because that sort of means that that environment, which is supposed to keep secrets, doesn't work anymore and kind of breaks it. So to Qualcomm's credit, Qualcomm announced that there are already patches available. The way they patch this is they have some microcode inside the processor that can sort of change certain behavior. And they didn't say what they did, but they could do something like intentionally flush the cache, or remove things from the cache, or change the timing of certain operations to make whatever technique was used not work anymore. But it does show that these attacks are real, that the SGX idea is valuable, but it is not sort of perfectly implemented yet, and it can still leak information. Okay, so let's move on and talk about the economics of security. And this is going to be hopefully much more of a discussion because there's not a lot of technical content. It's a lot more thinking about why the world works the way it does and drawing analogies to other parts of the world that have similar problems, or of other parts of our lives where there are similar problems to computer security problems, and how we solve those in other places. So we will be talking about the economic incentives of the various people who are involved in computer security. So for example, you as a user, what is your incentive around security? Microsoft as a software vendor, what is their incentive around security? The University of Wisconsin is a purchaser of large software, what is their incentive around security practices? Because we all sort of do different things for different reasons. So for example, recommendations used to say, we've learned that you should really have a different password for every website you go to, because if they don't salt it well and they find the hash of a password is used the same way as two different sites, and they break one password, they can break all the other passwords. So how many people here actually have a different password for every single site they go to? Okay, so 3 people or so. Do you use a password manager? Okay, do you use a password manager? How about people who don't use a password manager? Anybody have a different password for every site? No, you can't do it, right? That was a great idea when you had 1 password or 2 passwords, but when you have 100 passwords, it totally fails to have a different password for every site. And so your incentive is to say, it turns out the New York Times, I don't care if somebody steals my password there, because all you can do is read the New York Times and maybe renew me. You can't actually do much harm. And so I'm going to use a really crappy password that I use at a lot of other unimportant websites. I know people, for example, who don't even, they just make up junk passwords, and they always do password recovery when they log in, because it's not worth it to actually remember the password. Password recovery is pretty insecure because it relies on your email address, so you're sort of defaulting to something else. But there's a lot of things that have passwords that we don't really care about. For example, when I booked a hotel room for travel the other week, I had to provide a password to this hotel. I'm only going to stay at once in my life. I'm not going to put a lot of effort into making a high-quality password there. So we'll also talk about what are the disincentives, like why are you not encouraged to have stronger security practices? And then also, how can what can we do by thinking about economics to make things more secure? Are there ways that we can sort of align practices so that the people who care about security are able to sort of use money as a way to get more security? And then we'll talk about sort of what are promising things for the future, including one sort of academic research project that sort of demonstrated a different way of building software. So we'll start off by talking about how software is built today. And what this is typically called in a sort of a derogatory way is penetrate and patch. And what this says is that we develop something as quickly as possible. We get to a minimum viable product. We release it as soon as it functions adequately. And then we patch the code when problems are found. Right? So we have all heard about bugs in new applications. We've all probably used code that has bugs in it that sort of get fixed eventually. We hear about flaws, security flaws in various products where they didn't find it before release, so at some later point they have to patch the code to release it. So this is why it's called penetrate and patch. And typically, I think this is a bad approach to software development in general, to sort of release marginally working code that you wrote very quickly and then try to fix it later. But the question is, why does this happen? Why is this how so much software is actually developed? So one reason is that there is such an incentive in the computer world to be the first person or first company to do something. That if you, can get Facebook off the ground and get it going, even though there's lots of security bugs, once you get enough customers, you sort of have a locked-in base that will keep using it while you improve security. So there's a huge incentive to get something out there that functions, to try to get customers, to try to get them to use your system, even if the product doesn't work very well. The other thing is that computer systems also are what sometimes called a network economy, which means that the value of a computer system is related to how many people use it. The more people use it, it becomes much more valuable. People, for example, with Facebook, if only 10 people were on Facebook, it would be pretty useless for you to join because nobody would be there. When half of the world is on Facebook, it's pretty valuable to join because almost everybody else is there. So the value of Facebook goes up for you as more people use it. With other things, the value of other people having a car, the value of you having a car might go down when other people buy cars because there's more traffic. And here it's the opposite. The more people use something, the more valuable it becomes. So this means that if you get something out there quickly, people start using it, you get a lot of users, a lot more people will join you, you'll get a lot more market power. So for example, Windows. So that was we talked about a social network, and what about operating systems? how does this idea apply to operating systems? Any thoughts on why this sort of network economics and penetrative patch applies to operating systems as well? What is it about how people use operating systems that sort of encourages this sort of need for rapid growth initially? Any thoughts? Yes. Right. So the key thing here is that if more people use your platform, more people write applications for your platform, which will cause more people to use it. So there is this growth effect that as you get enough popularity, you get applications. So if you look, for example, at Microsoft's Windows Mobile operating system, you know, they were late to market. They didn't have very many customers, and so they couldn't get app developers to write apps for Windows Mobile. They had to actually pay companies to develop applications for Windows Mobile because they wouldn't do it on their own. Customers found there weren't any applications that they wanted on Windows Mobile, so they didn't use it. There was a self-reinforcing cycle that meant Windows Mobile was irrelevant. Similarly, that's sort of why we only have 2 operating systems out there in mobile, Android and iOS, because anybody who creates a new one won't have any users, nobody will write applications for it. So this really encourages getting something out there quickly. So Android, when it came out kind of early. It was pretty buggy. It had a lot of security problems. There is, you know, Android has had malware problems since the day it was released, but they got it out there quickly. They were able to get a lot of users very quickly by giving it away. And so this is a way to sort of get market share. You don't get market share by releasing something late that is very secure, it turns out. And the challenge is designing something well and to be secure takes more time, right? You have to think about all the security problems we've talked about here. You have to think about how do you design your software. And the fact is, what fraction do you think of graduating students from University of Wisconsin know how to write secure software? Now we have like 500 people are getting bachelor's degrees in 2 weeks. What fraction of them do you think can design a secure application? What fraction of you do you think can design a secure application? I don't think I could. I mean, I know about security, but I don't know enough to sort of know the details, right? And so finding people who know security is expensive. Designing things to be secure takes time. It's sort of cheaper to release something and then let people find bugs and then patch it, to sort of let your users be your testers. The other problem is that there is not a serious cost today to releasing insecure software. Think about how many companies you hear about who have massive breaches. We heard about the Yahoo data breach. Well, Yahoo did pay a price for that. But we hear about security problems all the time, but we don't see those companies that have the problems go out of business. We don't see other companies necessarily changing their practices. And so having insecure software isn't necessarily that expensive if you can fix it. And so we'll talk later about why is it not that expensive to a company to have insecure software. Any thoughts? Like, why is it not that expensive when Microsoft released Microsoft Word and you could put macros in it, those macros could spread viruses? Why was that not very expensive for Microsoft? Any thoughts? Yes?
Microsoft correctly a lot of storing data that gets stolen.
Right, so Microsoft, the damage happens to Microsoft's customers, not to Microsoft, and so they're not paying the direct costs. But you know, in the car situation, think about cars. When Ford releases a car that is unsafe and somebody dies, you know, somebody at Ford doesn't die, but a customer dies, but it's a very different situation. So there are different rules on who is responsible for buggy software, which we'll get to later. So Microsoft isn't necessarily liable if somebody spreads a virus using a bug in Windows. Microsoft, it tarnishes their reputation, they have to do work, but they don't actually have to pay much money. So there's a question, and we'll talk about in a little while, what if companies selling software were legally liable for security bugs in their software? The same way that car manufacturers are legally liable if there's a flaw in a car. So Toyota had a problem where it seemed like their gas pedal, their brake pedal wasn't working, their gas pedal was sticking, and there's sort of a huge lawsuits over this. There were lawsuits against Ford when people overinflated their tires and their cars flipped over or something like that, and it cost Ford a huge amount. But the same thing doesn't happen to Microsoft or Google or Facebook. necessarily when they have security problems. So something to think about why. So, yes. Hardware is a little, I mean, hardware, people have sued Intel. So for example, Intel had a processor where certain numbers, if you divided them, would give you the wrong number. It's called the FDIV bug. And they were sued and lost a lot of money over it. They've been sued over the meltdown bug, and they may end up being, they may lose money in court over them over being vulnerable to the meltdown. So software is indeed different than hardware. And we'll talk about why that is later today. Yes?
If software vendors were actually private, wouldn't that be a big barrier to entry?
It would be a barrier to entry, right? So if you're a small company, you're a startup getting started and you're liable for things that your software may do, that's going to be very expensive. You'll need expensive insurance or something like that, or a lot of money, which may make it harder, whereas a big company like Microsoft or Google has a ton of money, they can afford that liability. So in general, regulations of this sort that sort of make companies more responsible tend to hurt small companies. So in Europe, there's this thing called GDPR, the General Data Protection Rules, and it says how you have to treat data. And it turns out big companies have millions of developers, they can solve this problem. They don't make as much money, but they can solve it and make your data more secure. Small companies can't really afford to do all that work. And so it actually helps big companies much more than small companies. So regulations really help big companies because they raise the barrier to entry for small companies to enter. They don't have all the lawyers to sort of deal with all the work, whereas big companies have the money to hire the lawyers. Okay, so there's a fallacy of penetrate and patch, which is that if we design something and release it, and we keep fixing the bugs, then eventually we'll have something secure. And the fact is, this is empirically false. That as you keep fixing bugs, other things happen. For example, often you add new features at the same time as you're fixing bugs. Those new features introduce new bugs. So if you look at the number of bugs in Linux over time, the number of bugs in Linux is going up over time, despite the fact that it has been routinely tested and patched over time. And part of the reason is that Linux is now 5 times bigger than it was 10 years ago. So there's just a lot more code. Even if your code has a lot less bugs in it, there's still just a lot more code to have bugs. And so this idea that you can take a bad design and just patch your way and test your way out of the security problems hasn't really worked out very well. So another question that comes up in security is, what about open source versus closed source? There's a lot of people who believe that open source software is inherently more secure because the code is widely available and lots of people can see it. The closed source software is inherently less secure because you can't see the not as many people can see the code and look for security bugs in it. Are there any thoughts? What do you guys think? Yeah.
I'm just in close sources, the attacker may have to guess randomly like that. So maybe, but also you can see the source code. Like we tell them to see what's happening there, so maybe more easier.
Right. So closed source has this, has this benefit of obscurity that you can see the binary perhaps, but you can't see the source code. That it makes finding vulnerabilities a lot harder in closed source programs. Assuming that attackers can't actually get the source code. So it's true, we talked about this idea that when you design for security, you should have an open design, and the only thing needed for security should be your sort of security keys. But that doesn't mean that obscurity doesn't help a little bit at least. It does help somewhat by making it harder to launch attacks. Other thoughts on this? Anybody else want to weigh in? What about what is your perception as people who use software? Yes.
So I like open source because I can use their code and sometimes provide software suggestions.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering why some companies choose to close their source.
So the question is, open source is great for you because you can use their code. Why don't every company do it? Does somebody want to take a stab? You want to try to answer this?
It's possible that other companies can look at your source code.
So one problem is that if you release your source code, somebody else can take that source code and release the product on their own. So think about in the App Store when a popular game comes out, like Temple Run. Very quickly you get a dozen other companies writing programs very much like Temple Run, but slightly different graphics that do the same thing. And so if your code is out there, it makes it even easier to have a good idea for someone to copy and use it immediately. So people don't release their code to sort of raise the barrier to entry to somebody to copy it. So Google, for example, known as generally being a decent company, has incredible secrets about what they do, and they don't release any of their back-end infrastructure really as open source. So the way they do search and indexing and the way that they rank things is very much a secret and not at all open. They have their own versions of MapReduce that are much faster than the publicly available ones that they don't produce because they believe that having this internally is a competitive advantage. It lets them spend less money on computers and have better results. And if they release that, it would be like Coke giving away the formula for Coke. So anybody could make Coke then with the same flavor. So typically companies will release things that are not core to their business, that are useful things that other people benefit, but that aren't sort of secrets that they believe help them get along.
Like even they don't release their code, they will allow people to do some reverse engineering to get the visual.
It's true, but reverse engineering is hard. I mean, a program, you can reverse it, but programs are big. Chrome browser is, 20 megabytes or something like that, right? So reverse engineering big pieces of that is very hard. Now, it happens to be open source, so that helps, but it's a lot of work, and so only if somebody really cares about it. So there's a handful of programs people put that effort into because they really care, but there's something like, 2 million apps out there for phones that people don't bother reverse engineering. There's been a huge debate about the security implications of open versus closed software. People claim that having more eyeballs looking at software means you'll find more security bugs. The problem is that it turns out finding security bugs is really hard, and if you have a bunch of people looking at code, it doesn't mean they know what a security bug looks like or they will find it. Because people will look at the interesting parts, the parts they want to optimize. They may not look at the boring parts, initialization functions that run right when you start up, or there might be a bug, you misinitialize something, or termination when you're cleaning things up. So they may not focus on the boring parts where the security bugs can hide. They often are not going to be security experts. So the other problem is that people have actually used open source to insert bugs into code, right? If the code is publicly available in a public repository, you as an attacker can potentially put malicious code into the open source project that other people don't see or understand. And then normally in a closed source system, that would be very difficult. So this is another challenge of open source projects, of sort of making sure that all the code that goes in is indeed secure. If you think about it, some of the bugs we have seen are very subtle. You wouldn't know looking at the code necessarily if there's a buffer overflow. And so inserting a buffer overflow into a program is probably not that hard to get something by other code reviews. So as an example, there's a program WFTP. This is an FTP client server, whether it's a client or server, 8,000 lines of code. It's security critical because you can connect to it and then it can sort of download, it has to log you in, and then you can download all the files in the system. So this was around for about 10 years before people discovered security flaws, despite being open source and being a fairly small program that a lot of people were working on. So in general, what people have found is that having something open source has not really done a lot for security. That if you have something that's very visible, like Linux, where a lot of people with a lot of security knowledge are looking at it, that helps. But in general, not enough people know about security and secure code and know how to find problems or have tools to find problems to actually help in open source. And the real challenge here is that the software is not designed to be secure. The challenge is that it's still sort of this penetrate and patch. Get something working, release it, increment on it. So think about Linux, developed as a project by Linus Torvalds, released on an FTP server in Finland in 1991 or something like that because he wanted to do that, and then continuously developed from this design that he came up with as a student. Fixing bugs as they came along. So for closed source software, the claim is because things are obscure, they're more difficult. But there certainly are lots of vulnerabilities that have been found. There are better and better tools for analyzing binaries. We saw some of those earlier this semester. So just being closed source, as people pointed out, doesn't mean you can't sort of disassemble things and figure out how they work. So, you know, it might help, but it's hard to say how much it helps and how much is it obscurity because nobody cares about your program as compared to obscurity because people can't figure out how it actually works. So people who care a lot about this, and there's people who care passionately about open source, and I think there's good reasons to, but they will often say, look, Microsoft software is not open source. Microsoft software gets attacked all the time. Therefore, closed source software is not as secure as open source software. And so, you know, one, this is not logically correct. The real problem is Microsoft software design methodology for a long time was the same as everything else, which is penetrate and patch. So that's part of the problem. Why else does Microsoft software seem to have so many problems in it? Jane. Right, exactly. Jane said it's popular, right? So if you have something that 90% of customers are running, it's a really big target because if you can break into it, you can attack billions of people. If you attack, you know, QNX that has 10,000 users, it's very hard to find somebody who can use that. Certainly Microsoft Office, used by 1 billion users, you find a bug in that or a way to exploit it, you can attack a lot of people. And so just looking at the number of bugs that are found in a project doesn't tell you a lot about how secure the actual software design is. It sort of tells you something about a combination of how secure it is and how much people care about looking for bugs in it. Because it might be nobody cares to find bugs and it's insecure. So the question is, what does this mean for you as a user, though? As a user, you know, should you prefer one system over another? What it sort of argues is that what we want is diversity. Right? We would like to say there's lots of different systems of software out there that none of which is very popular. So none of which is really worth attacking because it's not popular. So people have talked about sort of a software monoculture, where everybody in a big company runs exactly the same version of Windows on exactly the same hardware. This means that if you find a bug, you can instantly roll it out against 10,000 people. Similarly, if you look at corporate data centers like Google, they have 100,000 machines. They're mostly all going to have very similar hardware, very, very similar software, because this makes management cheap. But the downside is that if you find a bug, you can attack every single one of those machines the same way. So people have argued that really to secure yourself, run unpopular software, run different software than everyone else, because you will be sort of less of a target. So in that sense, running Mac OS may be better because people aren't trying to attack Mac OS users because there's not as many of them. Running Windows Mobile is probably more secure than running Android or iOS just because nobody cares about you. No one's going to try to attack you, even if it ended up being really easy, right? So being a uninteresting person is a great way to be secure. It doesn't help you if you actually want to use Facebook, though, or Snapchat, because those aren't available. Okay, so open source versus closed source. The data says not a big difference. What really matters is how do you design software? Design for security or just design something, get it out there very quickly. Okay, so another challenge is, sort of another economic challenge to security is to think about what is your job as a defender or a creator of secure software? What is the job of an attacker? So the fundamental practice is, as a defender, you have to stop almost every attack and find almost every bug. As an attacker, sorry, as a defender, as an attacker, you need one good bug. So there's inherent asymmetry in the attacker's job versus the defender's job. Because if the attacker finds one bug that the defender doesn't know about, that is enough to sort of break in. Whereas the defender might find 100 bugs, but if they miss that one bug that was actually used by the attacker, it doesn't do any good. So how much more difficult of a problem is this? Well, let's do the math on this. So suppose you have 1 million security flaws in some piece of software. I used to use Windows. I'm tired of beating up on Windows, so I'm going to pick Mac OS. Suppose there's 1 million security bugs, and there might be. We don't know. I mean, there's 20 million lines of code. It's not unreasonable. There's 1 million bugs. Suppose each one sort of exposes itself after 1 billion hours of testing. That's what the mean time between failures is. So you need to do a lot of testing to find this. So we have 1 million bugs. We can find them. Each one takes 1 billion hours of testing. So if we can do 1,000 hours of testing, we will find one of these bugs. This is just 10 to the 9 divided by 10 to the 6. So every 1,000 hours of testing, we can find some bug. So again, these numbers are fictitious, but they give you a sense of things. So if I'm Apple, I could say have 10,000 computers running testing analysis programs, developers looking at code. So I can find 10,000 security relevant bugs in macOS. This is great, right? 10,000 real bugs that are found. That's great that they can do this, they can fix it. The downside is there's 990,000 bugs they didn't find. So let's look at the defender's job now, or the attacker's job. So the attacker spends, this is Trudy the attacker, spends 1,000 hours testing and finds one bug. What is the probability that the bug that Trudy finds has actually been fixed? Right? There's only a 1% chance that that bug was found and fixed. A 99% chance, if this is all random and independent, which it isn't, that bug has been fixed. So this demonstrates, I think, very quantitatively how much easier it is to be an attacker in a system than a defender. Because you really just need to find one out of thousands of bugs versus trying to find all of those thousands of bugs. So what do we do? Any thoughts on this? Is this hopeless? So you can sort of see from this math, one thing you could do is if your software is closed source and Trudy doesn't have the closed source, maybe Trudy needs to spend 10 to the 4 hours, 10,000 hours instead of 1,000 hours because it's harder now. But doesn't mean bugs aren't findable. If you have, what you really want to do, if you can reduce the number of bugs so that it takes a lot longer to find bugs, so if you can have better software with fewer bugs, that is going to be the biggest impact, because that will mean that the testing that Trudy has to do to find bugs will be much harder. And as the defender, you would like to get away from using testing to find bugs and try to sort of remove them through a design process or a verification process that doesn't take millions and millions of hours. Okay. So this sort of gets to the cost and the benefit. Right? So a rational attacker, rational meaning they will do things where that economically make sense, is to think about how do attackers look at something versus a defender. So if an attacker finds 50 bugs in your system, which one will they use? They will use the easiest bug to exploit. So even if you fix the other 49 bugs, if you don't fix the weakest link in the chain, you are still vulnerable. So as a defender, a lot of what software companies do is they will run automated security scanning tools to find lots of bugs in their system. So these are bugs that are easy to find. They might be hard to exploit. So some of the things we've seen, like return-oriented programming, is very subtle. Spectre is a very, very hard bug to take advantage of. It's unclear that anybody has ever actually exploited Spectre in the real world. It's sort of an academic attack right now. As an attacker, you look for the easy things. And so if defenders are making the hard things harder, for example, my research on things like SGX makes attacking SGX harder, but that's not the weakest link in the chain. The weakest link in the chain is things like people using foobar as a password that I can guess in 3 tries. Right? So if that doesn't change, all the other security features don't matter. And so it means that as a defender, you need to sort of fix all the things that are easy to exploit first, because that's where attackers will go. You want to make attacking very complicated. You don't want attacking to be something you can automate with a script, or that you can teach and have as a class project, right? If you can do an attack as a class project, it's probably too easy. So this also means that as a defender, there's a hope, and there's a lot of people who try to design perfectly secure systems. If you look at people in the programming languages world, they will say, look, we built Java, and Java is perfectly secure if you use it properly. That you can have no buffer overruns, you can have no type mismatches, You can't have any null pointer. You can't have any double freeze. All the problems we talked about, you can't have in Java. So therefore, we should use Java to do everything. And I mean, do you buy this argument that if we just use Java for everything, then our security problems go away? Would it help? It would definitely help. So you definitely should do it because a huge number of the bugs are due to using C. So you should definitely do it. You shouldn't believe that it's that it will actually fix things, because if you have rowhammer, you can defeat Java security features using rowhammer. So all these features for a perfect system assume everything else is perfect. So perfect language security assumes a perfect operating system and a perfect piece of hardware, neither of which exists. So the other thing is that humans are not sort of perfectly rational random people, that we see lots of copycat attacks. We see, once the vulnerability is known, the standard practice is to start to automate it to make it very easy to attack. People will launch it, automate it against thousands of machines, and so even if it's something that was easily patched, if there's a small number of machines that are not patched, they can be found because the attack is so easy to launch. So this also makes it harder. Another thing to think about in this model, sort of thinking of the cost of an attack versus the benefit, is to compare against the real world. If you want to launch an attack in the real world, like steal something from a house, you have to actually go to the house, you have to risk being found, and it takes some time. And you have to sort of pick which house you're going to attack. If you're online, what do you have to do? You can simultaneously launch an attack on 1 million different computers, and you don't have to care about which one you attack. You can just say, I'm going to try 1 million and see which ones are vulnerable and hope you get a response. And you can do it very cheaply. So in the real world, every single thing you attack has a fairly high cost of getting caught, of time, investment. In the virtual world, you can attack millions of things at very little cost, so you might as well attack everybody and see who's vulnerable. So this means that just saying, well, I just have one computer running Windows XP, probably I won't get attacked, doesn't really follow, because if you're on the internet, somebody might just randomly try to attack you because it's so cheap and easy. So the cost of an attack is very low. So even for a very small benefit of 1% of machines being vulnerable, it can be worth launching an attack. So it's a good business. Okay, another thing, sort of economic challenge with security, is how do people buy software? Sort of what makes you choose to buy a piece of software? And we can talk about this a couple different ways. So one way is like, how does the University of Wisconsin buy software when they want to buy software? So there's some person, often there's some person whose job is the purchasing person, whose job it is to make a recommendation. And so, their job is buy secure software, get software that functions. But if you're that person, what you have to think about is, what is the benefit to me of buying the most secure software? I get to keep my job, I make a paycheck the other day. What if I take a chance on this? We know that nothing is perfectly secure. So if I buy something I think is really secure, they claim to be secure, but it actually has a vulnerability, then my job is at risk. Because I took a chance on some sort of lesser known product because it claimed better security, and there was a bug in it because everything has bugs. If instead I buy very popular software from IBM or Hewlett-Packard or Oracle or Cisco or Microsoft, then I can kind of look, everybody uses this software. It's got to be good software. Everybody uses it. You can't fire me because I bought software from Microsoft, because everybody uses it. And so your incentive as a manager is to really reduce the risk to yourself in a way more than reducing the risk to the company. And knowing that everything has bugs, if a bug is found in a Microsoft product, you're not blamed because everybody uses Microsoft. So you're in the same boat as every other company in the world. If you use software from a startup that was spun out of the University of Wisconsin, and you're one of 10 customers of this security bug, you're going to get blamed for buying this piece of crap software. So this means that people buying software are not really incented to buy the most secure software. They're incented to buy software where they won't get blamed if there's a security problem, which is a very different thing. Yes?
You kind of talked about the fact that we're usually looking for the best features at the lowest price. These are budget components.
Right. So we'll get to that next. So a related question is, when you're buying software, so we'll get back to sort of buying software. Okay, so another question that comes up economically is who sort of bears the cost of security problems and who pays for security features? So there's a great example of this if you look at the US banking system versus the British banking system in the 1990s. So the US banking system, when they established debit cards and credit cards, the rules basically said if a customer complains about credit card fraud, then the customer is assumed to be telling the truth unless the bank can prove the customer is lying and trying to defraud the company. So it said the banks were fundamentally in charge of security because they had to make sure they didn't get defrauded. In Britain, the system was different. In Britain, the law basically said we assume banking software is correct. If a customer complains about a problem with a credit card or a debit card, then the customer is assumed to be wrong unless they can prove that it wasn't them. And it's very hard to prove, that you didn't go and do something. And so what happened in the US is that US banks developed a huge amount of software to detect fraud. So how many people have gotten a text message saying, we saw a suspicious charge on your credit card, was this you? Right? So lots of people get this, right? Because the company has an incentive to say, because we're liable if there's fraud, we're just gonna check to make sure a purchase is real. Whereas in Britain, that didn't happen because the banks weren't at risk. If there's a suspicious charge, it costs them nothing, it costs you as the customer something instead. And so what it meant in Britain is that if you were a customer and you went to the bank and complained, hey, there's $40 missing from here, the bank would actually fairly often have you arrested for trying to defraud the bank. And they would say, look, our software is secure, therefore you had to have taken the money out, there's no way anything could go wrong. So what happened is there's this guy named Ross Anderson who's a security expert at Cambridge, and he was hired by all these bank customers who said, this is clearly wrong. And so he was able to go in and audit bank software in Britain. And he found that it was terribly insecure. So for example, in some banks, there's a problem, they'd run out of cash sometimes. And so they gave the bank managers and employees a special debit card where they could go to an ATM and they could take money out of anybody's account with this debit card, right? Without knowing the PIN. And so it turns out that without knowing the customer's PIN, there's a PIN on this card. So it meant that if you have an unscrupulous employee with access to this, they can go and take money out from any customer they want to. And it looked like the customer was taking the money out. It didn't look like the bank was taking it out. Another problem they had was that one company, another British banking company said, we're going to be helpful to you. If you ask for a paper receipt when you get money out of an ATM, we are not going to list that transaction on your monthly statement because you already got a statement when you got the receipt. You don't need it on your monthly statement. So bank employees would figure this out and they would make duplicate cards and they would go take money out and ask for a receipt, knowing that it would never show up on the statement. And so they could take a lot of money out and customers would never see these fraudulent withdrawals from their account. We will do this. So those are cases where the bank employees were bad. There's another thing with ATMs, which is how do you validate that the PIN is correct? So there's two ways of doing this. One is an online way, where you send the PIN to some central bank, the bank checks the PIN and says the PIN is good, you can take money out. The other way is to do it purely locally. So purely locally says the ATM will check the PIN somehow. So one bank had this practice that said if we have 4 digits in your PIN, then we will require that these 2 digits always add up to 8, and these 2 digits always add up to 7. And that's how we check if the PIN is correct. We just add these digits to the PIN and these digits to the PIN. If they line up, it's a good PIN. And so it meant that you could use any PIN that fit this pattern with any debit card. You didn't actually need to know the real PIN because this was all that the bank did. And again, banks could do this because they were assumed to be secure. They weren't sort of liable if somebody actually took money this way. So another thing that a bank did that was a little bit better is on your card, so the better way to do it is to have the account number and some encrypted PIN. And to be able to do offline checking, this is encrypted so that an ATM can decrypt and check this. So somebody figured out that these two weren't tied together. So you can, if you can find somebody's account number, you can copy the encrypted PIN off of your card, put it on a card with somebody else's account number. That check would work because this is a valid encrypted PIN, and you can take money out of somebody else's account. Because, again, the root is the banks weren't really liable for designing a bad system. They weren't designed by people who actually knew much about security. So a quick question, how would you fix this solution here? So you want to do offline checking. There's some key ATMs have where they can, decrypt this PIN or verify the PIN. What is a step you could add in the system? Yes. So you can encrypt the whole account number. That's true. That's one way. But you might want the account number to look things up. So suppose we don't. So totally encrypting the account number too might help. Well, so you're saying we're going to encrypt the whole thing, like all of this in one piece. So that would work. Other things that are a bit simpler. Yes. Right, so you want to tie the account number in. And so the new recommendation says when you're creating sort of the encrypted PIN, include the account number in here. Because this now binds the PIN to a particular account number. If you move this to a different account number, even if you knew the right PIN for this account number, the hash won't generate the correct thing and it won't line up anymore. So it's a very simple fix, but you need to have some security knowledge to realize that you need to sort of connect everything together. So the key takeaway here is that there's a big difference in sort of who should be responsible for security and what that means. The British system says it's all about users being secure, and so what it means, so they assume the real security problem are people letting other people see their PIN. That is sort of what the whole system assumes. But all of these problems here indicate that isn't the real security problem. The real security problem are things like bank insiders or buggy software. So they have the wrong security model of what they're protecting against, and by sort of making users responsible for everything. And there's also a very limit to what users can do. Right? As a user of a bank system, the only thing you can do is protect your PIN. There's nothing you can do to address the rest of this. If the bank is responsible, they can't protect your PIN, but they can do a huge amount more things to help protect the system. So this sort of gets at how should we think about who's responsible for security. So there's another case here. So in electronic money transfers or credit card transactions, companies sort of lay out standards of how you have to validate a credit card. You may notice that some companies make you, when you call up over the phone, you have to provide your CVC. Sometimes you don't have to provide it. Sometimes you use your card, you enter a PIN. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you use your signature, or sometimes you don't use a signature. And it turns out that the cost of a transaction varies based on which practice of those you use. If you, as the seller, apply more of these security properties, you pay a lower rate to Visa and MasterCard. So instead of 3%, you might pay 2% if you're verifying a PIN or verifying a signature. If you have a CVC code instead of no CVC code, then you might pay less, for example. So what this says is that this puts the incentive in the seller to say, if I use better security practices, my transaction costs will be lower and I'll make more money. So this is a nice way of sort of giving the people who can make a difference an incentive. The other thing about this system is that it says that if there's fraud in a credit card, the seller is somewhat responsible. So if you go to a company, to someplace and use a credit card and buy it, it turns out it's a fake credit card, very often the seller doesn't get paid because of the fraud. So the bank doesn't necessarily lose everything, the seller can lose things also. And that means the seller has an incentive to have good practices to verify credit cards because they won't get paid. If they got paid no matter what, their incentive would be to never check credit cards because they'll get paid. So again, the idea is to try to align who pays for security, who sort of pays the cost of security with the people who can actually implement security practices. So this means that, companies have an incentive to buy newer credit card readers because they will save money with the newer reader that lowers their costs. So a third example of this principle is botnets. So there was this botnet called Mirai. It was one of the biggest botnets in the world, and it worked by infecting webcams. Cheap webcams you buy from China for $25. They run a version of Linux. They all had kind of the same root password on them. Somebody figured this out, wrote a botnet that infected tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of these cameras, and then could unleash terabits per second of attacks on various problems. So what is the challenge here, right? The challenge is, as a customer using a camera, I don't suffer at all when my camera is part of a botnet because it still works as a camera. It's not using much of my bandwidth. I'm not getting attacked, and so I have no incentive to buy a secure camera. I have an incentive to buy an insecure camera because they cost less. And the camera manufacturer, they don't pay the cost of this. Their incentive is to make the cheapest camera they can, sell it as quickly as possible, make it as easy to set up and configure as possible, and to never support it or provide patches, because providing security patches costs money, and as customers, we typically buy the cheapest thing that Amazon has to sell. So you can see in this example, we as users are being rational, right? We are buying really crappy products because the damage it caused doesn't hurt us, it hurts someone else. The sellers are being rational and selling bad products because they don't pay the cost. But it's sort of the network and other people in the network who pay the cost. So how should we solve this? What can we do? Any thoughts? I mean, this is a serious question that nobody has solved. I mean, there are some partial solutions. Okay?
More secure versus cameras charges more. So if you really need that security, you need to pay a lot more to prevent from using more funds.
Right. So it's true. If you buy like an Amazon Ring camera, it's going to be more expensive but more secure. But the problem is that the insecurity of these cheap web cameras doesn't affect you. It affects everybody else on the internet who they attack, who they send spam email to. So from your perspective as a user, you are almost equally secure with an expensive webcam and a cheap webcam, because both of them will protect people from seeing your camera footage in general. The difference is one will allow you to attack everybody else on the internet. So why would you as a customer pay more for a camera that doesn't attack other people if that attack doesn't cost you anything? Yes?
I would say privacy concern, because if your camera is hacked, maybe your private life is.
Okay, so it's true. If somebody can hack into your camera, then you do have a privacy issue, and cameras are something sensitive. So the challenge is, how do you know when you go on Amazon and you look at a camera that gets 4.5 stars whether it can be hacked or not? It's difficult to know. Yes.
What if the government comes out with some rule to say
Okay, so people have talked about this. There's a research paper I read about this problem, and they said this is sort of a fundamental problem that economics won't solve as it stands, because everybody is rationally paying nothing for security, but there's a huge cost, and so we should have government regulation. And so there has been, I think that people have proposed regulation in California that says it's illegal to sell insecure Internet of Things devices. The problem is, how do you, I think it sounds like a good idea. How do you actually enforce it? Like, who decides what is secure and what is not secure? I think we've seen through this course that everything is ultimately insecure. So there's some bar that says something is secure or not. And we'll see in a minute how having somebody decide where that bar is has its own challenges. Yes?
Almost argue at some level, you have to impact the consumer because they're the one making the decision. So you have to meter their internet usage and bill them for the participation in attacks.
Right. So one thing you can do is you can say, for example, we are going to shut off your internet access if you're part of a botnet. So if your ISP, if Comcast or AT&T or UW Housing said, if you're part of a botnet, we're going to shut your internet off for a day. That would get people to listen, right? Because people like their internet. So if you have something to lose, so that argues sort of pushing the cost of the customers who could do something about it, pay a cost when they're part of an attack. So one thing that many companies do, I know Berkeley does this, is you can't get on the Wi-Fi network for Berkeley when you connect to the Wi-Fi network, you have to run a software security scanning tool. It scans your software to see, are you running a securely locked down operating system, or is it something with lots of known bugs? So for example, have you not installed, run Windows Update in 2 years? And if you aren't running the latest version, they will not let you onto the Wi-Fi network. So that gives you an incentive as a user to sort of have better software that gets patched. And so similarly, you could say, my router will not allow insecure webcams onto my home network, and so if I buy the wrong webcam, it's not going to work anymore. If it doesn't get updated, it's going to break. So we need some way to push the cost back. Yes?
If you were to do that, what would be the incentive for your ISP to actually enforce that?
Well, sure, like, why not have, there's an ISP that enforces it and one that doesn't enforce it, and the one that enforces, why wouldn't I just go to one that doesn't enforce it? So the reason is the ISPs have to send your traffic somewhere. Nobody wants their crappy, unprotected traffic, right? And so ISPs, they have to pass traffic on. They may have to pay more to send traffic to somebody else if it is known to not be protected against botnets. So, for example, we talked about, when we looked at packet spoofing, we talked about ingress filtering, where you only allow packets in that are sort of from the right with the right source address. So that is a case where ISPs had to sort of make a change to limit the traffic they were sending to do that source filtering, but they have an incentive because whoever they want to send the traffic to may not accept their traffic or may charge them more to send traffic if they don't apply that. So you would need, what I think you're getting at is you need the same thing to put pressure on the ISP to enforce this rule. And so, similarly, AT&T could, like level 3, which is a backend provider, could say, if we see botnet traffic coming from an ISP, we're going to start charging them more to connect here. Or we are going to throttle their bandwidth to be a much lower bandwidth rate, and their customers will all suffer. So you do need sort of some continual pressure all the way through the system. That's a good point. Okay, so one of the ideas is, what if we evaluate software to see if it's secure? So people have done this. The military cares a lot about secure software. So in the US, there was something called the Orange Book. There are actually a set of rainbow-colored books. The orange one was the one that said how to build secure operating systems. And it lays out 7 different levels. There's like C1, C2, B1, B2, A1, and A2. And they get increasingly more and more secure. And in the US, the model for how this works is if you want to sell secure software to the government will either inspect the software themselves, they have to have the source, or the government will hire a company to inspect the software. So the government has to pay money to inspect your software, which is expensive, and they don't want to do it to a lot of software. So it's not good for small companies. They'll do it for something very valuable and big, like Windows. So Windows got a C2 certification. But the key is the government had to pay for it. In Europe, they had a very similar set of rules called the common criteria, which again sort of laid out what does it mean to be secure software. In Europe, the model is the government doesn't pay. Instead, there is an independent evaluator, an auditor, and as a company, you can pay an auditor to go and look at your software and rate your software as to how good it is. So this is a lot how credit rating works. If you're a company that wants to borrow money, you can go to Moody's and say, evaluate my company, tell me what my rating is, am I AAA or B+ or something, and then I can go borrow money. So these systems end up with very different incentives. So in the US system, the government is paying for the evaluation. So if you're an evaluator, how do you get more business? What is it you do to get repeat business in the US system? Right? You do a good job evaluating, because if you say something is good and it turns out to be bad and have bugs in it, you're not going to get hired again. If you find a piece of software and you find bugs in it, they'll say, oh, you're doing a good job. You actually found things that are insecure, they can be fixed. So your incentive is to find problems and to make sure that things you've said are good are not later found to be bad. In the European system, you're hired by a company, right? So who is paying your bills? The company that says their software is paying your bills. How do you get more business? You get business by certifying software is safe. So the easier it is, the more lax you are, the more money you make. Right? So the European model, the incentive is to say everything is secure, not take it very seriously, because that's how you make more money. And so there have been a lot of cases in Europe where people said something was secure, and there were sort of obvious problems that the auditors didn't find. And so again, there's sort of a principle here that if somebody's paying for an evaluation, then you want to make sure the person who is sort of buying the security product pays for the evaluation. You don't want to let the seller of the product pay for the evaluation. The downside is that it's a lot cheaper for the government to let the companies pay for it, and it can work for smaller companies because anybody can get their software certified, not just the companies the government decides to spend money on. So the general principle here is to think about, in general, in designing any kind of big complex system, who should bear the responsibility of security, and to align it with those people who can do something about it, right? So banks control most of the banking infrastructure. They should pay for most of the security costs. They shouldn't be able to pass it off onto customers who control very little. In the networking case, in the webcam case with a botnet, it's the networks that care about botnets, and so the networking people are in a position to apply pressure to say, we're going to make it more expensive if you don't treat your network well. In the evaluation case, it is, let's make sure we're assigning who's paying for the evaluation with the people who want the best result. Let's not align it with the people who want the worst result. So these are all cases where the economic system is kind of backwards, but if we can change sort of who is responsible for security, we have a potential to fix it. Any questions on this idea? Okay, so let's get back to software liability. So in the US and many countries, there is a standard liability law when you buy a product that says without some kind of agreement, a company is liable. When you buy software, you have an expectation that you're getting functioning software. And if the software did not live up to sort of a reasonable standard of what secure software should be, if a user suffered some harm and the software caused that harm, then the software vendor should be liable. This is sort of what is true for most products. If you buy a toaster and the toaster catches fire because it's made incorrectly, then it's reasonable to say the toaster manufacturer did the wrong thing. If the user put it in the bath with them, it's not the toaster manufacturer's problem because the user didn't behave as expected. But if the toaster, if the user is just using it to toast toast and it catches fire, there's a problem. So what's interesting is this does not apply to software. And there's a question of should it apply to software? So if you look, for example, this is the Apple license agreement for operating systems. And if you look closely, it says, to the extent not prohibited by applicable law, in no event shall Apple, its affiliates, agents, principals, or licensors be liable for personal injury or any incidental, special, indirect, or consequential damages whatsoever, including without limitation damages for loss of profits, corruption or loss of data, failure to transmit or receive any data or information, business interruption, or other commercial damages or losses arising out of or related to your use or inability to use Apple software services or any third-party software or applications in conjunction with the Apple software services, however caused, regardless of the theory of liability, contract, tort, or otherwise, and even if Apple has been advised the possibility of such actions, right? So it says even if we knew there was a problem, even if somebody told us our software was bad, we're not responsible for anything, right? This is how software is different, that software vendors have a license agreement, which means you are not really buying software, you're licensing it from a company, which means you can have a contract that sort of overrides the default rules of liability. And this has been great for software companies, right? We have a $1 trillion software business or something like that because we have these license agreements. But at what cost, right? Because this means that companies that write buggy software are not liable for bugs in the software. So people have proposed, as I mentioned before, that companies should be liable. So suppose, for example, Microsoft was liable if there's a major security bug in Windows that was sort of foreseeable, known to people in the state of the art as a problem, could have been repaired. And you can distinguish between something that is sort of an expected problem versus an unexpected problem. Meltdown, I think Spectre, we would say, is not an expected bug. It is sort of, something nobody saw for 20 years. So other things like a simple buffer overflow is a bug people have known about for 20 years and been fixing for 20 years. So what are your thoughts on, should companies be liable? And one thing to think about is what happens to open source software? If, who is liable if you use Linux and there's a bug in Linux, or you use Apache, or Android, which is open source software? Who is liable there? Is this a solution to our security problem? Because what it does is it pushes the cost of security onto the companies writing the software, who then have an incentive to write more secure software. Does anybody want to advocate for this? Nobody? Then you have to stop complaining about insecure software. Not really, but. Right, because what we've seen so far is that writing insecure software makes perfect sense for companies because they make more money, it costs them less to develop, they get more customers, it costs them less to write the software, and they're not liable if something goes wrong. And so it's perfectly rational to write and release insecure software in the world we've created. Yes?
We have not tried to pass regulations to make companies liable.
Did not ask to do what?
Regulations
Regulations.
for making companies liable, at least the government closed source software.
Right. I mean, if you think about it, the companies that sell software can spend a huge amount of money lobbying. So if there's any effort to add liability, Microsoft and Oracle can spend, it's worth it to them to spend $1 billion buying up every member of Congress to prevent that law from passing, because it would potentially be so expensive. So there have been, efforts to do things like this. But again, there's a problem you get into a problem with the details of, what happens to open source software as an example. So another problem that comes up in software is customer information. So this is, how do you know when you're buying software, this came before, whether it's secure or not? There's this standard economics problem that I think got somebody a Nobel Prize in economics. And it's called the lemon problem. And the idea is you go to a used car dealer, you want to buy a car. And suppose half the cars are lemons, or in my example, 20% of the cars are lemons, which means that they don't work, you drive it, you'll buy it, drive away a week later, it's a piece of garbage, you have to throw it away, you lose everything. And 80% of the cars are good and work fine, but you don't know which is which. So from the car dealer knows, so it's asymmetric information. So the car dealer can price them all the same because they know which works and which doesn't, and they can basically lie to you about how well a car works. As a buyer, you don't know. What does this do to you? It means you're going to pay less for all cars because there's a 20% chance the car you buy is a piece of junk. So your willingness to buy a car goes down because you don't have this information. If you knew which cars were good cars, you might be willing to pay 20% more because you knew you were getting a valuable car, right? So when Consumer Reports rates cars and says Nissans are really reliable, you trust that, you spend more for a Nissan than for a Yugo. If anybody remembers a Yugo. But if you don't know, then will pay less for everything. So the result is, as a user, we don't know which pieces of software are really secure. And so we will sort of discount everything to some extent and pay less because we can't tell whether it's worth paying more to get a more secure piece of software. So this kind of goes into what information is available when we buy software. So some information we have, right? We know what the price is, that's published. We know what the features are, people write about that, we can try software out, we can see the features. We can measure the performance, so we can see how fast it works for what I care about. We can learn something about the reputation of the company by, going to Amazon or something like that. But we really don't know how secure it is, and there's really no methodology out there for measuring the security of a piece of software. So this means that even if we want to buy secure software, it's very hard to go out and do that because we can't tell whether it's actually secure or somebody's lying to us. So as an example, how many people have been online and they found an ad that tries to sell them, says your computer's infected, buy some antivirus software. Right? It turns out that like 90% of those are fake antivirus software that will actually scan your system and steal your secrets. Right? They are the opposite of security software. And so as a customer, it means how do you know whether you're buying real McAfee antivirus software or the fakeo stuff on the internet that will actually steal everything from you? You can't tell. It means you're less likely to buy any security software or pay a lot less for it because you don't know if it works or not. So this is a challenge that we don't have good ways of evaluating reliability and security. Okay, so we've got about 6 minutes left. What can we do? we can take inspiration from other fields where this problem happens. So for example, we think about these external costs of security, like in the botnet case. What about in cars, right? There's a huge cost in cars where somebody driving a car hurts or kills somebody else or damages property, right? There's lots of car crashes where somebody, destroyed, like somebody drove into a building near West High School in Madison. There's lots of pedestrians who get killed by cars. How do we solve this in the car industry, right? We don't ban cars altogether. We do say have legislation. But the number one thing we do is we have insurance that says we know accidents will happen. We want to make sure that an accident happened, you have to pay. And so we will charge you insurance to sort of cover the cost. And the key thing is that what you do as a driver affects your cost of insurance. If you're a good driver, don't get in accidents, and you're not 18, I have a son, so I know this, your insurance is a lot cheaper. If you've gotten in a bunch of accidents, your insurance goes up. So the key is the price of insurance relates to what driving practices you follow. This means that as a driver, my incentive is to not have accidents because I will pay lower insurance. So there are some insurance companies, for example, that will sell you a tracking device to put in your car where they can monitor you at all times. And if you do indeed stop at stop signs and pay attention to the speed limit and stay in your lane, they will drop your insurance rates dramatically because they know you're a safe driver. So that incentivizes you, if you get that box, to be a safe driver because you pay less. So this is an example of how we get users to potentially do the right thing because doing the wrong thing costs them more. So there's a question is, can we apply this to, I went too fast. Can we apply this to security? So for example, suppose you were required when you connect your computer to the internet with your ISP, you have to have insurance that says that if my computer is used as part of a botnet or used to send spam, my insurance company will pay a cost to the companies that were targeted. This would mean that if I didn't have secure software, the insurance company would charge me higher rates. If I was running an older system, if I didn't patch it regularly, then I would pay higher rates. So this is one way of sort of making that cost more visible and passing it on to users. So that is sort of a promising idea people have been talking about for a while. Do any of you have thoughts on whether this would be a workable approach or not? Right, for example, I pay Charter $50 a month for internet service. Maybe I pay them, $60 a month if I don't have a firewall installed, but only $40 if I do install a firewall. Yes.
So like with that system, you have to get insurance for every piece of computer, every electronic thing you have, every computer. You'd have to register your computer.
So you could potentially say, it's true if you install, a cheap webcam on your network, then what we're doing is we're ensuring the network connection. So you wouldn't necessarily, I haven't thought this out completely, so I'm making this up myself. So, but the idea is you're ensuring the network connection against being misused. And so you don't have to register everything, but if you send bad traffic, you'll be charged more to connect to the network. And so if you put a firewall in that sort of, prevents DOS attacks from coming from inside your network, if you buy more expensive IoT devices that are less likely to have a security problem, that monthly insurance costs would go down. So you wouldn't have to register necessarily. Yes?
It seems like, to me, under this model, it would be like some kind of collusion between some software providers and these insurance providers to incentivize users to buy certain software.
Yes, that is completely true. So for example, my insurance company right now says that if I have an Apple Watch and I track my fitness on it, I can save $150 a year. Right? So there could be collusion between Apple and my insurance company to sell more Apple Watches. They do not take my Amazfit Fit watch that only costs $90. I can't save any money on my health insurance with that. So you're absolutely right that there can be collusion. The difference is if the insurance companies actually pay a risk, they have to pay out. So if they are telling you to use insecure software and it doesn't actually reduce the risk, they are the ones who are paying the cost of damage. So they will be paying out more than they're bringing in, than they are sort of getting. And so their incentive is to not tell you to use bad software to some extent, because it won't do what they want of actually reducing the damages they have to pay. So there's some built-in mechanisms here. Other thoughts? Yes.
It also seems like there's a fundamental trust problem here, which is who do we trust to monitor and determine who gets fined or charged when bad things happen.
Right.
The SEC, the insurance company, there's a lot of information.
Right, there's definitely a lot of logistics here, and that sort of argues why, there's a lot of reasons it hasn't happened, that, because people, these costs are not distributed so that insurance would help today. But there are you can buy data insurance, so companies can provide data protection insurance. So if they are hacked and they lose data, that the insurance company will pay for it. The downside is that those clauses, they have a lot of escape clauses. So there's a case last year where Maersk, one of the biggest shipping companies in the world, was attacked by a virus that came in and deleted all their files. And it turns out it was written by the Russian military. And the insurance clause said this insurance does not cover acts of war. And they said because this was from the Russian military, it was an act of war, even though it was against a Danish company that was not at war with Russia. And so the current insurance market is kind of weak. So we'll stop here. We will not talk about how academia provides hope. But you're welcome to read up on SEL4 if you want. And next week, we'll be talking about Bitcoin, and then we will have a review next Thursday.